Okay, here's an idea. Automated behavioral-driven testing of your event-driven microservices. Sounds great, right? But how do you do it? Well, I talked to SmartBear's Ale and Sana today about that and some tooling that SmartBear makes that supports things like this. They actually are responsible for a lot of products that you're probably familiar with, and she's got some great thoughts on the topic. I'd love you to listen in to us talking about it on today's episode of Streaming Audio, a podcast about Kafka, Confluent, and the cloud. Hello and welcome to another episode of Streaming Audio. I am once again your host, Tim Berglund. It seems like I always am Tim Berglund. It's unescapable. And I'm joined today in the virtual studio by Alianna. Ali runs, she's a product lead for API and virtualization. Am I getting that right? API testing and virtualization at a company called SmartBear. And if you don't know who SmartBear is, you probably use some things they're responsible for. Ali, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Hey, tell us about, I want to hear about SmartBear and kind of some of the projects and technologies that are associated with you. And I mean, really, what I want to talk to you today about is testing event-driven systems and how you are seeing the maturing of testing and just the maturing of event-driven architectures in general, because you are close to a lot of this stuff. But tell us a little bit about yourself. What does a product lead do there, and how did you get to do that?
Sure. So I have been doing various types of platform product management for longer than I care to admit, I think. And I was a customer of SmartBear before I came here to work on virtualization and then API testing. I was a customer of SmartBear through Swagger. So Swagger UI and Swagger Hub, the specification, formerly known as Swagger, Open API specification. So as a platform person, I was always responsible for delivering my company's information and insight. And as it turned out, a lot of the SmartBear products were how we did that, or at least were the backbone of how we did that. In addition to Swagger, we also have products like Ready API for API testing and virtualization and performance testing. And outside of the API business line, we also have test management and functional testing. And so there, the brand that people are probably most familiar with is Cucumber. So behavior-driven development, BDD. The Cucumber folks are also SmartBears. So yes, we are a pretty big tech company that you may not have heard of, but we are really happy to be here today and to talk about event-driven architecture, which is one of my personal favorite topics in the API space.
Absolutely. And yeah, it was the Cucumber connection that got me when I was introduced to you guys. I'm like, wait, well, okay. And I know that you probably get that a lot, but also I like that you have a name for people who work for the company, and it's so obvious. I don't know why I didn't think of it, but SmartBears. So at Confluent, we occasionally talk about that. Like, are we Confluenters, Confluence? I mean, like, there isn't anything obvious. Also, I feel like I need to say, the bear is just there. Generally, it's got nothing. This is not a plant for today. The bear is just a part of my office. This is when we kicked off the Confluent Community Catalyst program in, I guess it was September of 2019 in San Francisco at the last in-person Kafka Summit before the pandemic. The Catalysts got together at Build-A-Bear down on the pier in San Francisco, and we made, it was the first Build-A-Bear I'd ever made. I've spent maybe four figures on Build-A-Bears through the raising three children, and this is the
I've
first
got a
one.
7-year-old. I am right there with you.
Yeah, it's such a great idea.
Yes,
so it's
SmartBear. I was going to say, my brand people will probably come for me for this, but we used to have a bear. His name was Eugene, and now we have. If you look at our logo, it's the Gear Bear, which I actually kind of like because we're builders. We're building bears. So,
Sure.
But yeah.
Sure.
Brand, don't come for me.
Please don't. And not a paid endorser of Build-A-Bear. No association with that at all. Just, who doesn't like stuffed animals? I guess that's all I'm here to say. Anyway, more about event-driven architecture is probably a good idea. So there's a technology that has been on the radar. I mean, this always happens. There are things that that start popping up that, the first time you see it, you're like, what's that? Then all of a sudden everybody's talking about it. Um, Ready API is a thing that I could say in the Kafka Summit
Mm-hmm.
call for proposals and a sort of program committee process for this year. We're having 3 Kafka Summits this year, which is a lot. But I've seen a lot of Ready API stuff. So could we start by could I start by asking what is that and where does it fit into the world?
Sure. So Ready API is our it's our platform for API testing, and there's a lot of different ways that I think people sort of talk about API testing. There's sort of simple validation, checking. Is this endpoint supposed to give me back a phone number? Does it? Success. There is validation against specification. So when you have a specification like the Open API specification that tells you a little bit more about the architecture of the service, things like, I don't know, how many different response codes are there? Are there some example interactions that the specification gives you an indicator for? So, sort of the next level up is making sure that those things, the build meets the spec the same way that, an inspector that was looking at a build of a house would want to make sure that you haven't moved a load-bearing wall or anything. And so we've seen this really evolve very strongly for RESTful architecture, but what we've noticed at SmartBear and what Ready API has always really supported is multi-protocol. In fact, Ready API started its life as SOAP UI. And it was called SOAP UI because it put a user interface on SOAP protocol APIs. And so we built out from that. And so within the platform, you can not only do sort of simple validation tests for REST and SOAP, GraphQL, and other event-driven protocols like MQTT, JMS, AMQP, and now Apache Kafka. So not only can you sort of validate payloads, make sure that all of those things look good, but in addition, we believe very strongly in testing from the spec on down and testing the capabilities. When you're thinking about a microservices architecture, if you only look at what a single endpoint does and you don't look at the integration steps, you do wind up missing out on really important data in terms of how people are consuming your service and what are some of the patterns of consumption. And there's a lot of ways that are contained within a spec that you can test. And then there's a lot of things that happen outside of the spec that you could change, like rate limiting. And so Ready API not only validates what's there and how an individual service works, but it also allows you to create very simple chains of behavior that are not very brittle because they can be derived and refactored from specification. And when I say that, I mean specification schema for GraphQL. All of those are brought into the tool, and you can build tests from the components in those sort of descriptions, which helps us make the test less brittle. And it also helps us to understand a true end-to-end or journey scenario, as our BDD folks would call it, and use that to validate, and then take the same test, use it to performance test, and take the specifications and create virtual services so you can isolate a system under test or virtualize a third-party dependency, so that you're really testing the right thing and sort of bringing it all together in your CI/CD pipeline, for example.
Right. So third-party dependency, when we're at the level of integration tests, sometimes one might have, things in the world that you want to. Can I say mock? Is it okay to say mock still? You want to mock those things? Okay.
Yes, you absolutely can say mock.
Okay. All right. All right.
But I will say this about virtualization.
The right way to do these things.
Yeah. Well, so there's one thing I will say about virtualization, which is mocking, especially in REST, mocking is often about an endpoint. And it is often sort of dumb. Like, it's just like, I'll give you response 1, then 2, then 4. What we allow with virtualization is, sort of routing based on headers and different things. It really creates a much more like a synthetic experience of the API, which is useful because when you're building with something that's a little bit closer to real life, you can validate a lot more. In fact, we have a lot of customers who they build a lot of APIs for their partners. And so they don't break their partners' implementations. They'll create a virtual service, host it up on a Vert server, and say, put it behind a gateway and say, hit it. This is what we're thinking for the next iteration of our product. here's the wireframe, essentially. Tell us if this works for you. And they get a lot of valuable feedback before they commit to coding something, which, I mean, if you think about it, like, we don't really have a great way of prototyping services. And service virtualization
Right.
for us is very much about that, in addition to,
Yeah.
third-party dependencies, things like not having your ops manager come for you because you accidentally did a performance test against Google Maps or Google's geocoder, things like that.
Which might cost money. Right.
I'm not speaking from painful personal experience at all on that one.
You're just saying one might do a thing like that, and that would be
Yeah,
bad, probably.
for example.
That's amazing. So yeah, and the whole so the behavior driven testing concepts, it seems like, have very much seeped into Ready API. I mean, it's that's part of the DNA from which it comes. Well, also
Hmm.
SOAP UI. I think maybe you told me that we had a call a month ago. Somebody might have said that. So it sounds vaguely familiar, but is again
Hmm.
surprising because like the little guy you used to give noogies to, is all grown up now. That's that's really cool.
Seriously.
Um,
Yeah.
and the whole importance of this kind of testing. You've hinted at this, and
Hmm.
there's a meme. For the video version, I should have had this prepared and printed out, but just kind of a family of integration testing memes that show things like extremely
Hmm.
awkwardly configured bathrooms with like doors that open into the toilet, and where the door got cut out so it could move past the
Yep.
toilet, and it says something like all unit tests pass. There's
Yep.
that whole that whole reason why behavior driven and I guess more
Hmm.
slightly more generally integration testing matters. And that's what Ready API does. That's
Yeah.
super cool, and it includes Kafka now.
Hmm. Well, and I think this is really the thing that we've been seeing. At one point in time, if you looked at the types of integration tests that our customers were creating, it was very much about, RESTful endpoint to RESTful endpoint to RESTful endpoint, right? Like, and that's fine, and we allow you to create that as a model, and then data drive that scenario with like happy path data, sad path data, wacky path data. Um, Let you do security testing, for example. But what I've noticed, especially lately, and hearing it from our customers, is really in almost every organization, there is much more of, polyglot services. People sort of saying, hey, we really understand our data model well for our microservices. We're going to use GraphQL backend for front end type of pattern. Help us get stuff out there more quickly for people to consume, or using gRPC for sort of speed, and for sort of the polyglot architecture on the receiving side. With Kafka, a lot of the architectural patterns, I think, of any microservices, any sort of domain driven design, something needs to traverse the boundary of that domain. I read a statistic once at Netflix: every call to their API fans out to at least 6 other services. So it's like you do something in your Netflix queue and rating service, like all of the things that potentially could update from that. And you can't achieve that without event driven architecture. But if you want to truly test the full workflow, you need to actually bring in the event driven services, and services like Kafka, which behave a little bit differently than REST. Surprise, you know? And so I think that's really a challenge of any testing tool. You can proxy anything, but how do you get something that can deal with things in terms of how natively it behaves and what your expectations are for a given service, or how it should integrate with other services? So tracing that chain of behavior and being able to evaluate it and then turn that same thing into a performance test is a pretty powerful thing to be able to say as you sort of extend your architecture.
I mean, I'm buying it just as you're talking. That makes a lot of sense.
I have a
And it's
very
not like
soothing tone of voice.
right? It's those of us in this line of work. It's just kind of natural. But no, I get it. I mean, I guess I already got why automated testing that was a level or two up from unit testing was a good idea. I'm not like you didn't need
Hmm.
to persuade me of that, but in particular with microservices architectures, um, why a framework to help you with that matters a lot. And you said something else in there that makes me want to ask you about something, because it strikes me that you are probably uniquely positioned to talk about this. You've got the synchronous world, and maybe the second generation of microservices architectures were and still are synchronous with REST and gRPC,
Mm-hmm.
and like we need frameworks to help test in that. And that's all a big pain. And Ready API, you're my only hope, or one of a small number of hopes. One of which is me building a bunch of bespoke stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but now that you have event-driven things and you've got Kafka in the loop, and that's supported by the product, um, you have to work with people. Like you, in particular, Ali, need to
Mm-hmm.
work with your customers who are doing, one, the synchronous thing, and two, the event-driven thing.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in the world? What do you see happening in the world there? Because like I know people I talk to, but they're all fairly explicitly Kafka people. Like I have this
Mm-hmm.
massive selection bias. They're already into it.
Yeah.
But you're talking to people who might not be, or who are on the fence. So just, I don't know, riff on what's going on in the world of event-driven architecture from your perspective.
Well, I think the sort of I can't really say historian. I have a degree in biology, but like the history buff in me says, if you want to understand some of the patterns that we're seeing, for the future of these things, look at some of the patterns that have already happened in similar situations. So I look at REST, which, though synchronous, I think what we really saw happening in terms of how RESTful architectures evolved is first someone was building an API to deliver on a thing, and it was like they were doing it, it was theirs. And then the first thing that sort of forced them to scale is other people found their API and was like, oh, this is really useful. I don't have to build customers the API. I'll use Bob's. And and then since, he didn't want to have to explain it every single time somebody wanted to use it, he started to do documentation. So from, sort of code first documentation, people started saying, all right, first thing we did was we scaled for, the use of the service scaling. But then the next thing that sort of happens is you start to see patterns or things that you want to surface to the larger organization. And so you have to start to scale in a slightly different way, or with a slightly different, I guess you could call it like an objective. And that objective would be more about scaling for how users are going to interact with your services, right? And understanding, automation, and making sure that the scenarios that you're trying to deliver do that. And then as your organization scales, and maybe you started to embrace things like design first, governance comes in. And I think this is something that's really kind of overlooked, because when you have really large organizations and you're telling, the devs, move faster, deliver more, test more, um, don't ever be a bottleneck, there are things that you just can't do unless you have a certain level of governance, because governance implies that assets are there, objects are there. There's a sort of way that you approach it. It gives brand and structure to your services. But in addition to that, it also means that you have more to sort of draw on, so that you don't have to create everything brand new. And the number of organizations that I've talked to that have like 20 different versions of the customer API, or, a million permutations of the customer object in their JSON schema or something like that, like it's a lot. And then the final level is really developer experience, for me at least, because we don't, this is like a new thing. We're sort of talking about like, ooh, developers deserve nice things, fill them at 11. Like,
Right.
but it's really important, because if you want people to use the same things, if you want them to know what's out there, to be able to reuse objects, to be able to reuse things so that they can go faster, so that they can deliver more, and you don't provide a simple, intuitive, um, helpful way of having them access it, it's going to be really difficult, right? So, this is kind of how I've seen things evolve on the RESTful side. And I've seen a similar pattern beginning to happen on the event-driven architecture side. Initially, it's a coding pattern. It's not an architectural pattern really. But as your approach to event-driven architecture evolves, and as the needs of your organization evolves, you're going to start to see the same thing. And I think personally, one of the reasons why you're not seeing people talking about event-driven, governance is there's certain platforms, isolated platforms that, you have to sort of be all in, and it gives you a certain level of that. But overall, the tool chain has not expanded enough to embrace those things. And I think we're seeing that right now. We're seeing it with specifications like async API that don't just talk about the payload, but they talk about the relationship between pub and subscribe. And we're seeing it with, companies that are providing developer portals and design systems and tools that help you think first and then execute on your event-driven architecture. So, if you look back to the REST world and see how that's changed, and things that you kind of think of as table stakes, we need to make sure everything is camel case or whatever. Like, those things are coming in event-driven systems as well, and it will help us move faster and deliver better and more efficiently, I think. Because in the end, like, I don't know that certain decisions that are, for example, governance decisions, are things that people feel all that impassioned about changing. Like, camel case, great. I'll just use that and we won't have that discussion. Like, you can save your creativity for actually delivering the value to your consumers.
Now, boy, that would be a great place to end, but there's just a little bit more I want to talk about. That was amazing.
I
When you
don't think
talk
I've
about
ever given a
governance,
short answer to anything. I apologize.
oh, again, occupational hazard, right? It's just the line of work some of us are in. We're rewarded for good solid answers. You talked about governance and maturity, and I think this is just a thing I've been thinking about a lot in the last year or so of just developmental stages that people and organizations and products go through. And when you look at governance features in a mature relational database, let's say, it's all there, right? Because it's been decades. It's actually been decades of these things being deployed in contexts where governance was a non-negotiable, features getting built in, some of them clearly features that really big customers twisted arms for, when you look at the documentation. So there's a lot of maturity there in all the good and bad ways, bad senses of that term. And it's not present in a 10 or 11-year-old system like Kafka. Now, when you get into the commercial side of things, you start to see more of that in like Confluent Platform, Confluent Cloud. But even so,
yes,
it feels early, and I hope my product people don't get mad at that. There's lots of cool stuff that we do on the governance front, but it's like, you're 13 and you just went out for your first track and field competition. You're running, and that's really cool. And you used to not be able to run that fast, but you're also not competitive at the college level. So we're early days in the event-driven world for things like that. What does good look like in your mind? Like, what would it look like? What would the feature set look like for something that felt grown up and completed?
It's really interesting. Like, I am a very strong, as a product person, right? I'm a very strong proponent of, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will appear. And I think that goes as well for products and features and things like that. Like, because if you don't go through those sort of evolutionary phases in the beginning, you're not going to know how you want that to work in the end system. So if you don't go through, the phase of understanding and using event-driven architectures as an architectural pattern and not just sort of a one-off in your organization, you won't ever get to the point where, like, what will you put in an event portal, for example? And I think from an event-driven architecture standpoint, I think one of the things that is a big driver of that as well is also how much importance organizations are attaching to their event-driven architecture. We hear a lot now, a lot more about real-time, and you think about things like, machine learning without a broker like Kafka. Like, how hard would that be? Because you want to replay history again and again and again to teach the thing. If that didn't exist, what would be the motivation to build something like Kafka? So I think there are going to be items that on that list that, like, you and I maybe don't know or can't see at this point in time because of how systems and needs and user needs evolve. But I think that there are a few things that we can kind of call out, because to me, it's one of the sort of central struggles of how does engineering explain to the rest of the business what they're doing? You know, and you know, the business needs drive what engineering builds and how engineering builds it. But you know, if you're refactoring or rebuilding an architecture to embrace Kafka or you know just event-driven architecture in general, that means it's time that you're not spending building something new or something like that. So you have to understand, well, what is the importance of it? So when I look at sort of where we want to get to, there's a few things. One is I think governance becomes a part of it immediately when you start thinking strategically about your event-driven services. And you know, I want to give credit where credit is due, because in the way that we've sort of built a maturity model at SmartBear for, you know, in general, how do you approach your APIs and services? Some of the analysts at Forrester have done a great job, and David Mutter in particular, thinking about event-driven maturity and kind of what they were seeing with their customers. And they too believe that, you know, we are not where we want to get to is the point where events are governed, where events can be presented to a consumer like an event portal, that type of thing, where the data is unsiloed, but the access is orchestrated. And I think, you know, and choreographed, and I think that's another really important aspect of it. And the organizations are actually beginning to see the importance of their event-driven architecture. So moving towards thinking of it as part of business enablement and not just part of the technical or even architectural patterns. Like, how does being real-time help you deliver on business value? And that's a really important, I mean, especially you think about the last year, we've all been at home working with our streaming services to, you know, entertain ourselves. I mean, when you think back even 5 years, the idea of being notified in real time about fraud at your bank, like that sounded sort of crazy, didn't it? Like they maybe could tell if you went to a foreign country that they weren't expecting, but that was about it. So much has changed because of the availability of data, the prevalence of machine learning, and the event-driven architectures that underpin it. But I think it's that business need that really is going to drive it forward. And that's why when I think about maturity and what elements that maturity model might have, it's not just technical, it's actually bringing the business in because they too understand the strategic importance of events in delivering the commercial vision. And we certainly have seen that with APIs. I mean, there's companies with billion-dollar valuations like Stripe that are API companies. Like that's what the product is. And so I anticipate we will see something similar with event-driven architectures and with externalizing events for consumption, for IoT devices, for all of these different things, and kind of bringing them together and presenting them cohesively is going to be a huge part of how we do that.
My guest today has been Alianna. Ali, thanks for being a part of Streaming Audio.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciated it.
And there you have it. Hey, you know what you get for listening to the end? Some free Confluent Cloud. Use the promo code 60PDCAST, that's 60PDCAST, to get an additional $60 of free Confluent Cloud usage. Be sure to activate it by December 31st, 2021, and use it within 90 days after activation. Any unused promo value after the expiration date is forfeit. And there are a limited number of codes available, so don't miss out. Anyway, as always, I hope this podcast was useful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, you can always reach out to me on Twitter at @TLBerglund. That's TLBERGLUND. Or you can leave a comment on a YouTube video or reach out on Community Slack or on the community forum. There are sign-up links for those things in the show notes if you'd like to sign up. And while you're at it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and to this podcast wherever fine podcasts are sold. And if you subscribe through Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover it, especially if it's a 5-star review, and we think that's a good thing. So, thanks for your support, and we'll see you next time.